was Catarina van Hemessen? How did she live and work? What were her hopes and dreams? Why is she remembered today at all? And, maybe most importantly, why did she paint her own chin so small? Spoilers, I'm not going to be able to answer most of these questions because if there were records of those answers, they have been lost to time. But, to start, Catarina van Hemessen was a Flemish Renaissance painter born in 1528 to father Jan Sanders van Hemessen and mother Barbara de Vivier. Not much is known about Catarina van Hemessen, mostly due to a lack of records. Her contribution to the Western art canon is fairly small. There are only 10 known works that can be confidently identified as painted by her. Of those 10 works, 8 were portraits and 2 were religious pieces. She did have some success as an artist during her lifetime, however. She was patronized by Queen Mary of Hungary and mentioned in the writings of 2 Italian biographers in the late 1560s. So, to get a little more granular, like many women painters, Hemessen was instructed by her father. Jan Sanders van Hemessen was a big-name Flemish Renaissance painter whose works married the styles of the classical Italian Renaissance with the influence of northern movements. For some reason, he painted the chins on his women subjects very small. Did women just have smaller chins back then, or was this a stylistic choice? Was it considered beautiful for a woman to have a small chin? There might be answers out there somewhere, but answering those questions is not the point of this video. It was probably a stylistic preference, because some of these are a little cartoonish. In any case, Hemessen apparently inherited her father's preference for painting dainty lady chins. Now that I've answered the big question from the introduction, I do hope you'll stick around with me for the rest of the video. Hemessen painted this self-portrait when she was 20 years old, as noted by the caption in the upper left-hand corner. I, Catarina van Hemessen, have painted myself, 1548, here age 20. One of the remarkable things about this portrait is that it is the oldest known example of an artist, male or female, painting themselves in an easel. Unlike the direct gazes of Sirani and Fontana, Hemessen's eyes are focused beyond the viewer. In her right hand is a brush, and in her left hand is her palette and maulstick, a tool used to steady the painter's arm. Her painted figure has begun the process of the self-portrait on the painted easel, although this smaller self-portrait within a portrait is mirrored. Some historians have suggested this self-portrait is a loose imitation or homage to a self-portrait painted by the German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer in 1500. The inscription in Hemessen's portrait reads similarly to the inscription in Dürer's. His is written in Latin and reads, I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, portrayed myself in appropriate colors, aged 28 years. Secular portraits were typically painted using a 3/4 view in the 14 and 1500s. Dürer's direct, full frontal pose was more commonly reserved for figures in religious paintings. The thought here is that Dürer painted himself as an allegory for Jesus Christ. The pose, with his right hand raised to mid-chest and directly facing the viewer, the appropriate colors of the dark background and the brown Dürer used for his hair and beard directly reference religious imagery of Jesus Christ. Hemessen's portrait also contains a plain, dark background that gives no indication of location or environment. Her inscription floats in the black space between her head and easel. She has created a cross with her brush and maulstick, and the tools intersect and hover over the beginnings of her smaller painted face. Is it possible she's also positioning herself as an allegory of Christ? I'm on the fence about that one, honestly. Speaking as someone who was also a 20-year-old woman at one point in my life, on the one hand, she had the education, skill, and wit to do it. On the other hand, even with skill and education, everyone has their no thoughts, head empty period, and one's late teens and early 20s are prime time for that. So, I don't know. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it was an accident. All we can do at this point, so long after her death, is to speculate, but speculation can be fun too. Hemessen painted a second, very similar portrait in the same year, Woman at the Virginal. The caption on this one notes the sitter as aged 22. Given the woman's age and resemblance to Hemessen, historians believe this to be a portrait of her older sister, Christina. Based on the matching composition, the size of the panels, and the mirrored poses of the two subjects, Hemessen likely intended the two portraits to be displayed side by side. Each sister is rendered wearing fine velvet sleeves with heavy brocade bodices and skirts. However, this was not practical everyday wear, especially for a painter. For the purposes of Hemessen's self-portrait, at least, she painted herself wearing this impractical outfit to reflect her status as a woman of the upper class. The activities the painted Christina and Catarina are engaged in reflect their education. The virginal, a type of clavichord, was commonly taught to upper-class women as part of their education. Painting was also acceptable to women of the upper class, although few women continued to paint after marriage. Hemessen became a master in the Guild of St. Luke in Antwerp, where she lived. For some context, the Guild of St. Luke was a common name for a city guild for artists. The local city government granted the guild the authority to regulate certain types of trade within the city, most significantly the sale of paintings and other art. Antwerp was the home of probably the most famous of these guilds. Membership was required before an artist could take on apprentices or sell paintings to the public. Hemessen's father, Jan, was obviously a member, and at some point Hemessen herself was able to join and take the title of master. Also of note, Hemessen did have 3 male students, although I wasn't able to find any more information about them other than that they existed. Hemessen was either quickly approaching old maid status or had already arrived there by the time she married in 1554 at age 26. Her husband was Christian de Morin, the organist at the Antwerp Cathedral. This was a pretty prestigious position in 16th century Flanders. In terms of economical strategy, Hemessen's marriage was a sound one. At some point in the 1540s, likely in the very late 1540s, Hemessen gained the patronage of Queen Mary of Austria, sister of Emperor Henry V. Mary's brother Henry put her in charge of governing an area of Europe known as the Low Countries, which at the time were the Netherlands and Flanders. She was a great patron of the arts and owned several important masterworks, including this saucy little number by Jan van Eyck. Queen Mary abdicated her position as regent of the Low Countries in the fall of 1555 and moved to Spain shortly thereafter. And in 1556, Hemessen and her husband moved to Spain at the Queen's invitation. They didn't live there for very long, however, as Mary passed away just 2 years later in 1558. She left a generous pension to Hemessen, large enough to take care of her for the rest of her life. Without her patron, Hemessen had no reason to remain in Spain, so she and her husband returned to Antwerp, which is likely where they lived out the rest of their lives. Some of the sources I used to research Hemessen state her death as sometime after 1565 when she was 37. Other sources pinpoint the year of her death to around 1587, which would put her at 59 years old. I understand the reason for this type of discrepancy has to do with record keeping at the time. Some sources could find no mention of her beyond 1565, while others were able to find her up until at least 1587. The sources that point to 1587 as the year of her death likely had access to better records and were able to research and record more comprehensively. Historically, in Europe, death records, if they were made, were kept by local churches. Hemessen lived and died over 400 years ago, and without an enthusiastic local biographer such as Malvasia to make note of her passing, it's not hard to imagine such records becoming lost or destroyed in the intervening centuries. There are no signed and dated paintings by Hemessen after 1554, the year she got married. It's thought that she stopped painting entirely once she was wed, which wouldn't have been unusual for the time period. But I think it's unlikely that she quit painting entirely. She and her husband were financially stable thanks to the pension provided by the late Queen Mary, and there are no records of the couple having had children. Some kind of occupation would have been necessary, if for no other reason than to keep from going absolutely stir-crazy. I think Hemessen likely continued to paint after she was married, she just stopped signing her name to her works. Art historians also seem to think that, because there are a couple of unsigned paintings floating around that are attributed to Hemessen, which are dated in the years after she was married. This painting, dated 1559, is of an extremely uncomfortable-looking child holding a bird. I don't really have much to say about this one. I feel like it speaks for itself. This Portrait of a Young Lady is dated 1560, at which point Hemessen would have been 32 years old. Just based on the quality of the digital image, it looks like this painting has survived the test of time a lot more successfully than some of Hemessen's other works. If Hemessen truly did paint this portrait, then it also shows some pretty dramatic artistic growth. It really is a shame she wasn't able to continue painting in a more consistent manner after her marriage. Based on her existing works, it would have been a real privilege to observe how her work might have evolved over the course of her lifetime. To conclude, I'm going to talk briefly about my little master copy. This is the fourth one I've done now, and I'm not sure if these are getting any easier or if it's just because, compared to Serrani and Fontana, this portrait is very plain and simple. I was able to finish this one to my satisfaction in about 3 hours. Since I couldn't really tell what was going on with the skirt based on my reference, I blocked it in but didn't do much else to it. The sleeves and the little bonnet came out nicely, and, well, I've painted 4 faces in this series so far, and this one is by far the closest I've got to the original. I definitely feel like my ability to reproduce what I'm observing is getting better, along with my vases. So, I guess we'll see how well this improvement holds up in a couple of weeks when I leap forward 200 years to look at the life and art of Louise Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. Maybe I'll do all right, or maybe I'll eat my words. I'll let you know in a couple of weeks. I hope to see you then.